it's going to video so that we can send it to people like Sheila and mine. So I'll hand over now to Lee.
Okay, thanks very much. I think most of you will remember Pete Horsfield. He's been around for a long time, and as Ros says, he very sadly died about 10 days ago. And if you're going to remember Pete Horsfield, that's the way he probably would want to be remembered. Pete, like many people who are innovators, who are pioneers, who've had to spend their time fighting bureaucracy, fighting entrenched views, fighting the obstinacy of people who don't have the same sort of vision as himself, was quite a complex character. And yet at the same time, once it became apparent that what had happened, and people knew that I was going to talk about him, I was inundated by comments about what a kind, caring individual he was. A complex character, which I'm just very briefly going to touch. And I'm mainly going to touch on the things which affect us, health informatics, and one or two things that people in health informatics do. Pete, who was born in 1954, trained in Nottingham as a medic, and then went into practice in Derby Road Health Centre in Nottingham, we think in about 1982. Very early in his career, he started to get interested in the what was then fairly primitive computing that was available to people. He started to do his own programming. He even did some programming in Sculptor, which is, for those of you who've ever come across Sculptor, is quite an effort in it, and particularly in those days. We're not quite sure when he joined the primary care group, but it was 1980 something. He was involved in, and I don't know how many of you would remember, probably not very many, but in the early days when we had Geoffrey Dove as our secretary, the alcohol within the group flowed very freely, even more freely than it does now. And there was the wonderful time in St John's College in Oxford, where we were having the AGM. After the dinner, which we had in their magnificent dining hall, we moved to an ante-room, and Geoffrey Dove started purchasing the founder's port from St John's College, and it was beautiful. It went down magnificently. And at some stage in the evening, I remember looking around, and there were this group of people, including Pete, and surrounding them on the floor were a whole raft of bottles of empty port. He also, fairly early on, got involved with the EMIS user group. He joined it, we think, in 1992. And subsequently became part of the EMIS national user group, and he actually organised their first national conference, which was in 1994. There is a theme that runs through this, as you'd expect. He was heavily involved in the primary care group. For many years he was our, as we called him then, telematics officer. Communications were just starting then. The internet was just beginning to get off its feet. We can well remember some of the early conferences when he was going to talk about the internet, but of course he needed a live internet feed, and in those days gold dust wouldn't buy you one. But he tried, and he was very far ahead of the field in terms of looking at communications. Communications we now take for granted. He was the vice chair of this group for some time, and he was always seen as being having a very dry sense of humour, but a very good sense of humour. He was always seen that no matter what was happening to him himself, he didn't wear it on his sleeve. He showed his courage very lightly, and he attended many of our conferences, most of our conferences in fact. He also was an active user within the ClickSig user group, which, as most of you know, has done an awful lot of work in terms of the development of health informatics in the UK in primary care. And then lots of other work that he did with the primary care group. So he was very active within it. One of the other things that he did right from the word go was get very heavily involved with the Nottingham Mafia. In the tower block associated with Nottingham University, Sheila Teasdale, Mike Bainbridge, Di Evans, and one or two others. Is John here? Oh, sorry, yeah, and John. started to look at the development of health informatics with a more academic rigor, and Pete was fundamental to that. They started off doing Jigsaw 1, which was really developing a health informatics curriculum. That then developed and morphed into CHDGP, collecting of health data for general practice. And that itself then morphed into Primus, which we've all heard of now. And so Pete was very active in that. One of the reasons he was very active in that is that he was known right from the word go to understand an awful lot about terminologies, about data quality, and about that most difficult thing, being able to put together logical queries on medical data to achieve something that one wanted to. And that was certainly in the early days was something that was quite fairly unique. But it's something that throughout the opinions that people have been expressing, the logic of his mind was always put forward as being a very important element. And so he remained with Primus, with one exception that I'll come back to, as Primus developed. There again you can see, I don't know how well it's coming out, this is Pete on this side, which therefore isn't projecting very well, with Mike Pringle and Mike Bainbridge and, oh God, I've forgotten his name. And so he worked hard with them, both in terms of developing the technology, developing the queries, and in fighting the political battles which were a continual battle for Primus. As well as that, in 2003 he moved to CHDGP. He was there between 2003 and 2007. And he did a number of things whilst he was there, but one of the things that was very important for everybody was that he was the prime driver. He wasn't the only one. He was the prime driver of devising the business rules for the data extractions of the QOF. And QOF wouldn't have been what it is, well, has been, and it wouldn't have been as successful as it has without Pete and this logical mind of his and the dedication to his work which he was capable of doing. One of the interesting things also that I was told, which I hadn't realised, by another of our friends who's not here today, that he was also, in the days of a certain Richard Granger, he was a great ally to those who were clinicians within Connecting for Health, because in those days, being a clinician, you carried a black mark around with you, and yet Pete was very helpful in developing that. This picture is fairly typical because it's Pete with Mike Bainbridge poring over their hot laptops, working on developing queries and developing the use of terminologies. But Pete wasn't always about terminologies. He wasn't always about the technologies. After he'd been with Connecting for Health, he moved back to Primus, and as you can see, one of the things we're going to be doing over the course of this 2 days is awarding the John Perry Prize. I assume we are in here. And Primus actually won the John Perry Prize in 2007, and this is the presentation, which, as you can see, has got John, it's got Wendy, it's got Sheila, it's got Mike, and that's Pete there, next to Joan Perry, who will be presenting the John Perry Prize. Pardon? Joan Trowell, sorry, yes. Beg your pardon. Mrs. Perry, Joan Trowell, yeah. And so Primus has been his home very much, which will be important in a minute when I come later on. But he was very much somebody who liked to do other things. He had a penchant for boats. This is actually Cheryl's boat that he's sleeping in. And in fact...
Where's my breakfast, actually?
And that's him helming Cheryl's boat. Well, actually, Steve Smith's helming it, but he's there. Pete was very keen on all sorts of outdoor activities like that. And he was also an avid twitcher, an avid bird watcher. I can well remember, as I'll come to a little bit later, on one occasion a group of us were sailing across the Irish Sea. We'd got all the sail up and the spinnaker, and the wind got up and the wind got up, and until it got to the stage when I thought we might lose the boat. Ian Herbert and Pete Horsfield weren't interested. They were mainly arguing about whether or not they could, that bird they could see was a kittiwake or was a Manx seawater. So he got involved in things, and he got involved in a number of things, and one that you'll not be surprised to know that I'm going to talk about is the Three Peaks Yacht Race. Now, for those of you that don't know, the Three Peaks Yacht Race is a race whereby yachts start in Barmouth on the west coast of Wales, go up to Carnarvon, which means going across what's called the Carnarvon Bar in the middle of the night in a gale, and then in Carnarvon, two of the crew have to run up and down Snowdon, which is somewhere over here. And then you sail up through the Menai Straits, across the Irish Sea to Whitehaven, where two of the crew have to get on their bikes, cycle to Ennerdale, and then run up and down Scafell and come back again. And then when you've done that, you have to sail all the way around through the gap between Ireland and Scotland, all the way up to Fort William, where two of the crew then have to run up and down Ben Nevis. And when you've done that, you fall flat and get drunk. Now, this is a race which is a very serious race. It's usually won by the SAS, by the Marines, or by, these days, by professional international racing crews. But we decided, well, I say we decided, it was one of these things which I'd had an inkling for some time. I mean, I'd got a boat, and I'd had a friend of mine who'd done the Three Peaks 10, 15 years before, and I'd always had this inkling that it'd be nice to do the Three Peaks race. And then a certain Di and Pete, quite independently, came up with the same idea. And so, at a primary care group conference, after the dinner, it came out that we had this joint idea of doing this, and we decided that because we were getting on a bit, but we were all health informaticians, so there were a number of criteria. One was that everybody on the boat had to be a health informatician. The other was that we had to make sure that we had the oldest person we could find to run with us, so that immediately we appointed Ian Herbert. So we then had a crew of 4 who were going to sail on this race. And we took it all very seriously. This is actually the night before the race, when Pete and I did a fair amount of work in terms of silly saying you're off sick when you're going on a race like this, which is fairly hairy. So Pete became the skipper, and Pete skippered this whole thing. He insisted that the crew were always active. This is in Barmouth the night before the race, and as you can see, there's Pete lying down on Di, there's Ian there, there's me, and our 5th member, which was David Staples from EMIS. Di got David because Di knew that David was another of these people who likes running down mountains. So we had a crew who fitted all the criteria that we wanted, and we had a skipper, and that's the crew just before we left, this time slightly more prepared, and if you can see the expressions on their faces, they're rather more stressed than they were in the previous picture. But that's before we left, ready to go, and that's our skipper, ready to drive us forwards. Pete was a brilliant skipper. I remember the first time he skippered the boat, he insisted on a certain Ian Herbert driving on a particular course in a particular direction, even though it made us go aground in Plymouth Harbour.
I obeyed orders. I was told.
But Pete, no, seriously, Pete was great. One of the accolades, David Staples was particularly keen that I pointed out what a good skipper Pete was. And that's the boat. It's a westerly consort. It looks a bit low in the water because the crew are all standing on this side, but that's at the quayside at Barmouth before the race started. So we set off and took this thing on. We went through the Carnarvon Bar at 3 o'clock in the morning in the pitch black when it was blowing a force 6, and that's extremely dangerous, and it was fantastic. It was really the adrenaline started running as we went through there. We then, after 2 of the crew had run up and down Snowdon, we went through the Swellies. This is probably one of the most dangerous sailing waters in the world. It's the bit of the Menai Straits where to get through is extraordinarily difficult. Pete conned us through there, and although you can't see it very well, this boat, my boat, under sail, because you couldn't use an engine, is yards away from a series of rocks which are just under the water. But he did it right. He helmed it exactly as he should have. Well, he drove it exactly as he should have done, and we got through without any problems. And then eventually we sailed across the Irish Sea. We got to Whitehaven, and whilst the runners were sent up to Ennerdale and Scafell, the rest of us relaxed a little bit. And then, so after that, we went round to Fort William and completed the race. That is the race crew at the completion of the race, with Pete, Di, David, Ian and myself. But actually the race crew were only part of this whole team, because there also was the support crew, and that's Pete with the support crew. The support crew, they followed us round. The idea was that, for example, when we stopped in Carnarvon or when we stopped in Whitehaven, the support crew would come along. They'd look after the runners going up and down the hills, or mountains should I say, and they'd also make sure that the boat was properly provisioned. That had a particular meaning in our case. If ever you want to, the full story of this race is actually still on the website, and it's entitled "The Voyage of the Good Ship Amicus," because that's and then the subtitle is "And the Alcohol Helps." So the support crew's main function was actually to bring as much gin as was needed onto the boat. But so the support crew was an important part of the whole, and we all worked as a team to get this completed and to finish the race. There, everybody's looking fairly wide awake. Fairly shortly after that, even though there's still champagne left in the bottle, that's the race team, or part of the race team, falling asleep at the table. But that was an interesting one, because we actually won 2 cups for that. We won the best dressed boat, which I won't go into the detail of why, because I still get a bit embarrassed. We also won what's called the Last In Cup, because there's a pub on the quay in Barmouth called the Last Inn, and it had presented a cup to the race for the boat that completed, because just completing is a major effort. Lots of boats fell out. And so it's for the boat that actually completes the race last. And so we won those too. Now, that was in 2004. We decided again at another primary care group conference that probably we ought to do it again and try and do actually better than we'd done. So we decided to do it in 2006. All went well. David Staples couldn't spare the time, but Di found another runner, Ben, who could help with the running. And all was going well till a few days before the race, when I got a phone call from Pete. Glyn, I'm vomiting blood. He'd actually got an ulcer and he was vomiting blood, and so he didn't know whether he could come or not. And by this stage I was in Barmouth with the boat already, and we were all ready to come. I even persuaded one of the local lifeboat crew in Barmouth to stand in for Pete if he couldn't make it, but that wouldn't be Pete. Pete turned up, only drank milk in the pub, but he also turned up with an intravenous giving set and bags of intravenous fluids in case we needed to drip him in the middle of the Irish Sea. I apologise, Di, I know the truth of that one. But Pete was quite determined that he was going to be part of it, and so the main crew carried on, and we did the same thing. We were going through Carnarvon Bar, the Menai Straits and so on, up to Whitehaven. And we got to Whitehaven, and 2 of the crew cycled and ran up and down Scafell and came back, by which stage the weather forecast for going through the North Channel between Ireland and Scotland was appalling. It was going to be at least a force 9. And so eventually, and although I was skippering, we took a democratic decision that we wouldn't go any further because it was just too dangerous. So instead we decided that we would see what the Wasdale Head pub, which everybody told us about at the bottom of Scafell, was like. So we went there. So Pete joined us. That's actually him with Ben. And you'll notice here that although Ben was looking decidedly worried about all the things we were going through. Pete was more interested in the birds that were flying around. So we then went to the Wasdale Health pub, and the thing I would point out to you, this is 48 hours after the previous picture. I don't know how well you can see it from there, but Pete's there, and he's now drinking a pint of beer. Back where he started. He's been very heavily involved in everything that we've done. The last time most people saw him was actually at the last annual general meeting. And again, I'm sorry, I don't know how well this is coming out from where you are, but Pete's there at the back at the dinner, dancing away quite happily. And of course, as some of you will remember, he also then got some lighted candles and danced around with lighted candles. He failed in igniting the curtains, and he therefore we survived and we were allowed back here. Now, as I've said, Pete was very much, as well as being very heavily involved with the primary care group, was very heavily involved with Primus. And Primus wanted to make their own contribution, their own tribute to him. And being Primus, they decided to do it in coding terms, in a terminology. Now, I'm so far out of it these days, I don't know whether these are reed codes or whether they're Snowmaid codes, but this comes straight from Primus. As you can see, he was very much cared for. What I haven't gone into any detail is Pete was actually never really a well man. He had dreadful problems with his spine, he had cancer, he had all sorts of other things, but he bore all that with great stoicism. He had quite a lot of that when we were sailing, because we did a lot of sailing as well as the Three Peaks race, and he bore all that. So, after we finish the AGM and we start the dinner, I hope we'll all raise a glass to Pete. I certainly shall. I was proud that he was a friend of mine.